According to the Global Slavery Index's findings in 2016, approximately 40.3 million people today are enslaved worldwide. And that's centered a lot in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and Sudan. Those 4 countries are in the top 10 countries where slavery is found and people are exploited. Now, what does that have to do with the United States? Slavery was abolished here over 150 years ago, but that doesn't mean we still can't feel the effects of it today. And a long-term scapegoat of slavery has been Christianity in the Bible for a long time. And that bothers me as a Christian. So it got me to thinking, does the Bible actually condone modern day slavery? And did it ever? Especially because slavery seems to be rampant in parts of the world that stem from Judeo-Christian society. So I looked into American history and the Bible as a reference, and found that no, that the Bible does not condone modern day slavery as we would think of it, because even though slavery did exist in the Bible, it was humane, it was voluntary, and it was limited in time. So, as I said, yes, there's absolutely slavery in the Bible. There's no getting around that. Abolitionist Francis Wayland said in 1845, "I grant at once that the Hebrews held slaves from the time of the conquest of Canaan, and the patriarchs had held them many centuries before. I wonder that anyone should have the hardihood to deny so plain a matter of record. I should almost as soon deny the delivery of the 10 Commandments of Moses." This is coming from Carolyn L. Shanks's The Biblical Anti-Slavery Argument of the Decade in 1830 and 1840. So to start off, the Hebrew word for slave is doulos, which can be translated as both slave and servant. Now notice one of those sounds a lot more mild than the other, and it's true. Slave didn't always mean what we would picture it to mean back then. It wasn't the horrible torture and everything that impression that we would normally think of in movies like The Prince of Egypt and in Les Miserables, and of course our own American roots. Now that did exist because the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt and Assyria and Babylon, but the difference was that God never condoned that. In fact, he freed his people from that and hated the nations and didn't like the nations that did that. So the point that I'm trying to get across is that oppression doesn't equal slavery in the Bible. Yes, they both happened, but there were different forms, and that's definitely not what was condoned by the laws of Moses. So to go into that, we'll be using Mosaic law to get into what was actually allowed in Israelite and Hebrew society. The Mosaic law will be the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And this is what Moses used to form a book of laws and customs that the Israelites would use after they came out of Egypt to form their everyday lives. So first of all, slavery was voluntary when it was allowed. Exodus 21:16 and Deuteronomy 24:7 say that it was illegal to kidnap and sell a person because that violated the commandment, "You shall not steal." So kidnapping people from Africa and bringing them here totally wouldn't have been allowed. Wasn't condoned by the Bible at all. Exodus 21:2 says that those servants would serve for 6 years, and the 7th year they would go free. There was also a festival called the Jubilee every 50 years that said that any slaves would go free whether they had worked their 6 years or not. And it was a contractual hired worker relationship. So the servant would enter into this willingly, and it would usually happen because, say, a person said, "I'm running out of ways to find food, I need shelter, I need wages." And so they'd say, "Can I work for you for 6 years and be your servant and stay with you?" And on the 7th year, they were left to go, and their employer or master would send them away with wages, with provisions, and all of that, so that they wouldn't be left with nothing. Also, Deuteronomy 23:15 says that if a fugitive slave got away, the person that they ran to could not return a fugitive slave to their former master. Abolitionists use this all the time. A good common example of this I can think of is Jacob in the book of Genesis, when he worked for his uncle Lot to win his two wives, Rachel and Leah. He worked for his uncle for 6 years for Rachel and then 6 years for Leah. And he got them both as wives after, and he left with provisions and wages and all of that after he has served. So now to move on to the humanity of it. Frederick Douglass, in his speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, said, "What, am I wrong to argue that it is wrong to make men brutes, to rob them of their liberty, to work them without wages, to keep them ignorant of their relations to their fellow men, to beat them with sticks, to flay their flesh with the lash, to load their limbs with irons, to hunt them with dogs, to sell them at auction, to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them into obedience and submission to their master? Must I argue that a system thus marked with blood and stained with pollution is wrong? No, absolutely not. That's horrible. But that's oppression. That's oppressive slavery that was never condoned. Leviticus 25, 46, and 53 both strictly demand masters not to rule ruthlessly over their servants. That was never allowed. And while it probably happened, there were severe penalties and repercussions if a slave was treated inhumanely. Also, American slaves wouldn't have been able to find this out because they were forbidden to read and write. So if they could read the Bible for what it was, they would have seen that this would have never been allowed in a Christian society. Now, one big argument against the Bible condoning slavery, pro-slavery activists' favorite verse, is Leviticus 25, 44 to 46, which basically said that slaves that weren't Israelites, foreign slaves, could be inherited forever. Now, the Hebrew word for forever here is olam, which is a variable amount of time, which here would have meant 49 years at most. Like I mentioned, there was the Festival of Jubilee every 50th year. At that time, every servant, Israelite or not, would have been set free. If you just read a little further past those two verses, you'll see that every servant was let go at the year of the Jubilee. So, and that can be found also in Caroline Shanks's article. So finally, I want to say, why would a religion that teaches to love your neighbor as yourself ever condone an awful practice like what happened in America and what's happening now? Before you debate and move on to blame Christians in the Bible for what's going on in the world, again, please listen to the words of apologist Howard Thurman, who said the slave undertook the redemption of a religion that the master had profaned. Thank you.